What's up? Got my microphone back. It's like a nice old comfortable warm blanket. Anyways, I had made a post on YouTube the other day talking about Colonel Edward Mandell House and the curious position that he holds in the history of our country, mostly right around the turn of the century, late 1800s, early 1900s. We all know that a lot was going on during that time. We had manufactured financial crises. We had the build up to World War I, eventually World War I, and all of the manipulation that was being done by the uber rich on a global scale for what we would consider probably the first time it was done on a truly global scale. Colonel House was one of those guys who very much loved politics but didn't want to be a politician. And so he became a bit of a kingmaker in Texas. It was in Texas where his father got his fortune during the Civil War, and the House family somehow made it out of the Civil War, where many of the other rich families were completely decimated. We'll get into how that happened later. But he became very, very close to President Wilson, and because of that, was very much involved in World War I, the Treaty of Versailles, the League of Nations, the Federal Reserve Act. He basically became the guy behind the guy that had connections to everyone and everywhere. And he was the first kind of politician like this that I see. Certainly an agent of the New World Order, but a very interesting one. So I was looking into the creation of central banking for current reasons, and he really piqued my interest. One of the main things that piqued my interest about the guy was this quote that's attributed to him on a lot of web pages. It's a quote that I've never been able to verify even after all of my digging at it, but it's a quote that I'm going to read to you guys now, because this is the straw man theory. And this quote, if it were true, would be pretty darn accurate in laying it out from beginning to end. So this is what the quote that's attributed to him, and he's supposedly talking to President Wilson in his private memoirs. In a private meeting with Woodrow Wilson, Colonel Edward Mandell House predicted the banksters' plan to enslave the American people. He stated, "Very soon, every American will be required to register their biological property in a national system designed to keep track of the people, and that will operate under the ancient system of pledging. By such methodology, we can compel people to submit to our agenda, which will affect our security as a chargeback for our fiat paper currency. Every American will be forced to register or suffer being able to work and earn a living. They will be our chattel, and we will hold the security interest over them forever. By operation of the law, merchant under the scheme of secured transactions. Americans, by unknowingly or unwittingly delivering the bills of lading to us, will be rendered bankrupt and insolvent, secured by their pledges. They will be stripped of their rights and given a commercial value designed to make us a profit, and they will be none the wiser, for not one man in a million could ever figure our plans, and if by accident one or two should figure it out, we have in our arsenal plausible deniability. After all, this is the only logical way to fund government, by floating liens and debts to the registrants in a form of benefits and privileges. This will inevitably reap us huge profits beyond the wildest expectations and leave every American a contributor to this fraud, which we will call social insurance. Without realizing it, every American will unknowingly be our servant, however begrudgingly. The people will become helpless and without any hope for their redemption, and we will employ the high office, presidency, of our dummy corporation, the USA, to foment this plot against America." Now, this is a pretty savage quote, and one of the first things that make you want to immediately disbelieve it is the fact that it lays it all out, you know? The evil guy who's pontificating his plan while he's got the guy tied up, who's got the piece of glass in his hand and he's sawing the rope, that only happens in the movies. So you're looking at these guys who were making plans. These are the guys who were controlling the world at the time, and they were making plans for this globalist future. And when we first discovered about the Illuminati, right, it was by accident. There was a courier in Europe who was struck by lightning, and the Illuminati plans were discovered, right? But it's pretty strange to have this quote out there and for it to be pretty well out there. So I was looking around to see if I could debunk it, and I ended up in the process learning a whole lot about Colonel House. I guess the best place to start is we have to look at how he was fitting into the entire geopolitical scene at the time, and it's all very much around finance. Because at this time they were attempting, the big monopolies, the power players on the scene at the time were trying to centralize the banking industry, because that was the focus of the power then. Now you could see that they're creating problems and offering solutions to different industries now in our time that they're trying to consolidate now. Those industries would be the medical industrial complex, the agricultural industrial complex. I mean, it's no accident that Bill Gates 10 years ago was the leading investor in vaccines, and that now, today, as of today, he's the largest owner of farmland in America. These people think 10 years ahead of us. So at this time, at the turn of the century in the 1900s, the focus was on centralizing the financial system. And we live under the centralized finance system that they created on Jekyll Island back then. We live under that now. I next went to an American Thinker article because the title struck me, and it's called Colonel House, the Man You Don't Know Who Ruined Your Life. A recent post mentioned some of our less savory administrative governmental heritage dating from the time of President Woodrow Wilson. Not mentioned in the article or the comments, understandably, was any reference as to how and why President Wilson came to represent a formative administrative state. The real story is interesting, informative, and important. At the end of the 19th century, a powerful Texas political governor-maker by the name of Edward Mandell House, nicknamed Colonel, though he never served in the military, looked to broaden his political and imaginative horizons by relocating to the East, where he assessed national politics and ferreted out a role to play at the highest possible social, political, and educational levels. All right, so he never served in the military, but after he got his first Texas governor elected, or you could say ordained, that governor gave him the title of colonel. Now, he was a Texas governor kingmaker. He made 4, I think, Texas governors before he decided to spread out and move east. And I just would like to point out to you where it says, where he assessed national politics and ferreted out a role to play at the highest possible social, political, and educational levels. Okay, you don't just ferret out a role in those places. You're gonna have to have some shoe-in. You're gonna have to have something that leads you into that, and it's really his father's actions during the Civil War and who his father was operating for that got him these later connections. He found an opportunity in the person of Woodrow Wilson, Yale University professor. Latching on to Wilson, just as he had when creating elections for Texas governors to be whom he favored, Colonel House decided to take a skillful and experienced shot at maneuvering Wilson into the presidency. House had other ulterior motives backing Wilson and soon introduced global aspirations and possibilities into Wilson's head that today must be recognized as having proved to be of great importance. House had authored a novel published by various accounts in 1905 and 1906 titled Phillip Dru, Administrator, which he made available for Wilson to read, digest, and hopefully act upon. The book depicts a second U.S. Civil War, with a participant, Phillip Dru, creating for the world, in the war's aftermath, a new world order characterized by a single administrator, Dru, working through a world bank, world court, world army, and a league of nations, i.e., utopia achieved. In this book, and I'll show it to you, and I'll link it in the description. It's a long book, but it's available for free, and you can listen to it. He is clearly laying out what I will call socialist aspirations. Obviously, the basis for the book is also running in parallel with the communist ideology. So this guy who writes this book and he makes all these globalist aspirations known, he then attaches himself to President Woodrow Wilson. President Wilson was energized by the fictional creation of House and was advised by House all the way through World War I. At the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, House himself, along with Wilson, convinced the participant nations to create a League of Nations. The U.S. was saved from League of Nations membership by the U.S. Senate's refusal to ratify such a relationship. But then, in 1943, the U.S. joined the Allies in agreement to form the United Nations after World War II. So, Wilson left, and when he did, House was there at the Paris Peace Conference things, and Wilson didn't count on losing the Senate vote. He had pretty much accepted that if they got the League of Nations created, the Senate would vote to ratify it, and it didn't. That surprised him and House. House died in 1938, advising U.S. presidents up through FDR, with fading influence after World War I and with ultimate failure in the League of Nations. The League of Nations caused a falling out between House and Wilson. The administrative state would go on to progress wildly beyond House's fertile utopian imagination to the monster administrative states we experience today. In this short essay, you start to realize that he was a serious power player, and he was a guy who started to merge these giant banking interests, these corporate interests, into interests of the state. And when you read Phillip Dru, Administrator, it's clear that the reason why he wants this is because he wants one giant administrative state to run the globe. I read the quote, and having my interest severely perked by the first article I read, I went somewhere trying to find this quote, trying to see if I could find any respectable author that will tell me this is a quote from Colonel House to President Woodrow Wilson. Still couldn't find it. But I did find this article, and I found it extremely interesting as well, and it will give us a little bit more insight into what was going on during that time period and the role that House had to play. This was written by a guy named Dr. Dennis Cuddy. It's called Colonel House and the Power Elite. Colonel Edward Mandell House was one of the most important figures in American history, but most people know little about him. On November 4, 1918, former President Teddy Roosevelt, from his office at the Kansas City Star, wrote a letter complaining about House's, quote, secret ways of handling business, close quote. But the story of House's secret ways goes back many decades. On March 13, 1809, British emissary John Henry wrote a letter about the desirability of separating the states within the U.S., especially using a series of acts and a long-continued policy dividing the North and the South. One such divisive issue was the abolition of slavery. In 1831, William Lloyd Garrison began the abolitionist newspaper The Liberator, with Karl Marx later as his European correspondent. A few years later, the plot began in earnest to divide the North and South. This was described in a letter President Lincoln's emissary to Vienna, John Lothrop Motley, wrote in the London Times in 1861. Motley wrote that the conspiracy was to have a southern republic comprised of the 11 deep South states and join it with Mexico, Central America, Cuba, and other islands with unlimited cotton fields and unlimited, quote, Negroes to form a great Gulf of Mexico empire. The conspirators included rich Europeans and Americans in the North who brought about the American Civil War, in which most Southerners were economically destroyed, except for Thomas House. In Arthur D. Howden's Smith's Mr. House of Texas, he wrote that Thomas House, quote, was one of the few residents of a Confederate state to emerge from the Civil War with a handsome personal fortune in cotton, land, and private banking. Why was that, do you wonder? In the latter part of the 19th century, Thomas House introduced his son, Edward M. House, to the rich and powerful, who by the early 20th century felt confident enough to assign Colonel House to advise President Woodrow Wilson. In 1911, Robert Minor, political cartoonist for the Pulitzer Publishing Company's St. Louis Post-Dispatch, drew a cartoon of Wall Street with J.P. Morgan, John D. Rockefeller, and other prominent people greeting Karl Marx, saying, "Delighted." The book under Marx's arm did not say communism, but rather socialism. And the next year, Colonel House anonymously authored Phillip Dru, Administrator, describing it as foretelling, quote, socialism as dreamed of by Karl Marx. Campaigning for the presidency on October 19, 1912 at Carnegie Hall in New York City, Woodrow Wilson delivered a speech in which he remarked, quote, some of the biggest men in the United States in the field of commerce and manufacturing are afraid of somebody, are afraid of something. They know that there is a power somewhere so organized, so subtle, so watchful, so interlocked, so complete, so pervasive, that they had better not speak above their breath when they speak in defiance and condemnation of it. Similarly, during the campaign of 1912, Wilson's National Campaign Vice Chairman William McAdoo proclaimed, "The fact is that there is a serious danger of this country in the hands of a small clique of enormously wealthy men who speak through their money and whose influence even today radiates to every corner of the United States." Colonel House was the chief agent of this power elite regarding President Wilson, and House's influence upon Wilson was tremendous. Wilson once said, "Mr. House is my second personality. His thoughts and mine are one." One of the most important pieces of legislation the power elite wanted Wilson to sponsor was the establishment of the Federal Reserve of Banking, which was approved in 1913. A key member of the power elite was Cecil Rhodes, who in 1891 formed the secret society of the elect to take the government of the whole world. In Rhodes' own words, "My information concerning the secret society comes primarily from Bill Clinton's mentor, Professor Carroll Quigley at Georgetown University, about whom the Washington Post Sunday magazine on March 23, 1975 published an article titled, 'The Professor Who Knew Too Much.' One of the top people in Rhodes' secret society was Lord Esher, who helped plot America's entrance into World War I, as he wrote in his diary on August 11, 1917, about the importance of shedding American blood as soon as possible. If many lives have to be sacrificed, the influence upon the American people can only be beneficent." About the war, Colonel House would later write in Foreign Affairs in June of 1923, "If war had not come in 1914 in fierce and exaggerated form, the idea of an association of nations would probably have remained dormant, for great reforms seldom materialize except during great upheavals." And this is the old, out of the ashes rises the phoenix. This is the old order out of chaos. This is the problem, reaction, solution. This is the viewpoint of the globalist, is what he's expressing right there. The ultimate goal of the power elite was and is to have a synthesis of Western capitalism and Eastern communism into a world socialist federal government. Late in 1917, the Russian Communist Revolution occurred and was supported by the power elite and Colonel House in order to use it as the antithesis to the American capitalist revolution, then synthesizing both into the desired world socialist federal government. This process was called the Hegelian dialectic. At the end of World War I, when Allied leaders Wilson, Orlando, and Clement were considering putting down the newly formed Soviet government, Colonel House in his diary admitted to lying to them about the inadvisability of confronting the Russian peril. Immediately after this entry in his diary, House then confessed that the military intervention could be successfully accomplished if gone about properly. A voluntary and mercenary army of very small proportions equipped with artillery and tanks would, in my opinion, do the work. Had Colonel House not lied to these leaders, there would later never have been no Stalin, no Chinese Communist Revolution, no Korean War, no Vietnam War, no Vladimir Putin, and on and on. House literally changed the 20th century and could be considered as indirectly responsible for a majority of the carnage for those years. Although Woodrow Wilson's presidency ended in 1921, Colonel House continued to have influence with people at the highest levels of government for many years. On November 21, 1933, President Franklin Roosevelt wrote a letter to House saying that he had just talked to Jack Morgan, and then Roosevelt wrote, "The real truth of the matter is, as you and I know, that a financial element in the larger centers has owned the government ever since the days of Andrew Jackson." J.P. Morgan worked with the members of Cecil Rhodes' secret society for years. And like I said, I'll link all these underneath the pinned comment below, and this essay goes on for pages and pages and pages. But one thing I did notice about it after I read the whole thing was that it didn't have the quote in it that I was looking for. So I was at a loss. I've done a lot of research at this point, and I just figured the last thing I could do is shoot off an email to one of the guys who wrote these articles. I chose Dr. Dennis Cuddy because this article is so well written and it's so well sourced. And so my assumption is that somebody who's writing such a detailed memoir about Colonel House, not including this quote about the straw man, it's because he couldn't verify the quote, is what I'm thinking. So I popped him off an email. And this is the response I got. "Thanks for the compliment, re my House article. Re the quote you cite, I think you find that in Phillip Dru, Administrator. The only thing I quote from that is where House talks about the future having, quote, socialism as dreamed of by Karl Marx. The reason House authored the book in 1911 anonymously and as a work of fiction is so that he could always disavow anything in it as his real beliefs. Even though, in my Secret Records Revealed, I include a quote from Wilson's Secretary of the Interior, Franklin Lane, saying that everything in House's book is coming true under Wilson. For example, where House wrote about socialism as dreamed of by Karl Marx, I have an article in the Knickerbocker Press wherein Wilson's head of War Industries Board, Bernard Baruch, says they are living under socialism. Best wishes, Dennis. So because I love you guys, I went and I read that entire damn book, and it's not in there. So, is the quote relevant? Yes. Is it accurate? No way to verify it. There's just no way to verify it. It is an unverified quote. But it's very strange that if somebody did, let's say somebody did make this quote up, right? Whoever did it had a very intimate knowledge, Colonel Edward Mendell House. And it makes you wonder, who with that much knowledge would take the time to write this false quote? One of the best places to find the information regarding the way that they created the central banking system is modernhistoryproject.org. And if you guys want to go there and do your own research, you can. It's packed full of information that you could, more information you could ever go through. But in regards to the creation of the Federal Reserve, they mention House here. In 1908, Schiff laid out the final plans to seize the American monetary system. Colonel, an honorary title, Edward Mandell House, the son of British financier Thomas W. House, a Rothschild agent who made his fortune by supplying the South with supplies from France and England during the Civil War, was Schiff's chief representative and courier. Now we know how it is that House is one of the only Southern aristocrats to make it out of the South still holding land and money, because his father was a Rothschild agent and was on the low supplying the Confederate States with supplies from various places. I think also from financiers in the North. But Bernard Baruch, whose stock market speculating made him a multimillionaire by the early 1900s and whose foreign and domestic policy expertise led presidents from Wilson to Kennedy to seek his advice, were relied on heavily by Schiff to carry out his plans. Herbert Lehman was also a close aide to Schiff. President Woodrow Wilson wrote about House. House is my second personality. He is my independent self. His thoughts and mine are one. If I were in his place, I would do just as he suggested. If anyone thinks he is reflecting my opinion by whatever action he takes, they are welcome to the conclusion. George Sylvester Varick wrote in The Strangest Friendship in History, Woodrow Wilson and Colonel House, that, quote, when the Federal Reserve legislation at last assumed definite shape, House was the intermediary between the White House and the financiers. So this guy, the son of a Rothschild agent and an old Confederate Southerner, this Texas kingmaker, somehow wiggles his way into Northeastern society and gets under the wing of Woodrow Wilson. And by the end of it is the go-between between Washington, D.C. and the financiers on Jekyll Island. That is quite a pivotal and powerful position to have wiggled into. And this episode is about House and not really about the monetary system, but suffice it to say they created what they called the Aldrich Bill at the time, and at the same time they created the Federal Reserve Bill in secret on Jekyll Island. And so as everybody in the country developed this ardent hatred of the Aldrich Bill, it was rejected, and then it was instead replaced with the bill that they actually wanted, the Federal Reserve Bill. If you can imagine being alive during this time period, you're having these manufactured runs on the banks that are being created by basically the whales of the market of that time period. They're basically chip whipping people and creating panic, and they're creating these bank runs. Now, everybody at the time thought they were happening organically, okay? So that was the problem. And then the reaction, so the problem was all the financial rigging that was going on. The reaction was everybody was running to the banks and trying to withdraw their money all at once. They were causing these runs on the bank. And the solution presented is the central banking system. Okay, and so at the time, it's important to think about it like this, because at the time, these people who were in the middle of this, these American citizens, they had no idea what was going on. They didn't see the way that they were being manipulated into the system that we live under now. It was impossible to see. Even the most genius people people of the time were not aware of the conspiracy that was going on. When you think about it in that way, and you understand that now they are trying to do the same type of corporate takeovers over medicine, and you can start to see their same outline, the same kind of plan being used over and over to take over industries and globalize them. When we're living in it, like they were living in it during the bank runs and all that, we're living in it now. And I think it's just as important for us to understand now, just like they couldn't see it then, we probably don't see it now. Even if we think we do, we probably don't. And it's going to be really hard to ever see it underneath this type of system. It's amazing to me that we can go through research like this and we can find this information out about people in our history. The last thing I wanted to tell you about House is they found a copy of the Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion in his private papers, but it's something interesting about them. Some time ago, Stan Monteith, a pioneer NWO researcher and broadcaster, found a typewritten copy of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion in the papers of Colonel Edward M. House at Yale University. This seemed like confirmation of the widely held view that House was a Rothschild agent. House was an advisor to Woodrow Wilson and FDR. It makes sense that they would have a copy of the blueprint for the New World Order in his possession. He probably referred to it while writing his political manifesto, Phillip Dru, Administrator. The 99-page House type script is a different English translation from the Victor Marsden translation, which is most commonly used. I suspect the protocols were originally written in French, originating in the Miserium Lodge. So far, I have just compared the first protocol, 8 pages. The most obvious difference is the title. Marsden's book is The Protocols of the Meetings of the Learned Elders of Zion. The translation in House's possession is Protocols of the Meeting of the Zionist Men of Wisdom. In this translation, meeting is singular, and the elders is clearly identified as Zionists. The significance is that Zionist used here is a movement for world domination, not one confined to establishing a Jewish homeland. The second point of interest is a footnote in House's typescript that does not appear in the Marsden translation. In relation to subjugating all governments to our super government, there is an asterisk reference to A.C. Shamokov, An International Secret Government, Moscow, 1912. This book is hard to find. It was sold for $805 by Kirsty's Auction House in 1994, along with a few other Russian examples of Judaica. Interestingly, Shumakov was not a communist Jew Mason of the kind that studied the protocols. On the contrary, House's version references a notorious anti-Semite, a man whose career was devoted to exposing the Illuminati Jewish conspiracy. His real name was A.S. Shamkov, and he was a lawyer, author, and member of Duma. He became famous when he volunteered to help the prosecution in the famous Mendel Belius case in 1913, where a group of St. Petersburg Jews was accused of the ritual killing of a youth. It is puzzling that House's version of the protocols would reference an opponent, unless the original translation originated with the opposition and came into House's possession. This interpretation is supported by another footnote on the page explaining that the Goys equals Gentiles. If this version originated inside the lodge, they would not need this explanation. And it goes on to explain some of the differences in the translations, but I find that extremely interesting, that his copy of the protocols could have originated with the enemies of the New World Order. And then it brings up the question of, well, then why was he studying it? If he was part of it, then wouldn't he have his own copy? He wouldn't need to acquire it from the people who were opposing the movement. And then when I thought about it for a little while, it also made sense to me that in his position, because he is a globalist, he is trying to establish a globalist governance, it would make sense that he would study this. Even if he wasn't part of this particular conspiracy, it would make sense that he would study it, learn from it, and take what he could from the information. So is it, was he part of that conspiracy just because he was in possession of those books? It doesn't necessarily mean that. This is a guy who was in charge of forming the League of Nations. This is the step one to the global government. So maybe he was just looking for ideas. Who knows? But it's a shady, shady past, and it's a shady, shady history for Mr. Colonel Edward Mandell House, the kingmaker of Texas. Alright guys, like, share, sub the channel. I'll talk to you guys next time. Peace.